So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about this morning. Central City, for those of you who are not from New Orleans, is located between the Garden District. It's adjacent to the Central Business District. Some folks in the neighborhood refer to it as Uptown, but it is a pretty large neighborhood in New Orleans. And your introduction made me remember some years ago I worked as a materials management clerk for an industrial construction company. And one day one of the guys came in the office and he said to one of the engineers, "I would say that you are completely useless. But even the worst of us can be pointed to as an example of what not to do." So I'm going to talk to you this morning about not one, but two attempts at community benefits agreements that we undertook. There are a couple of people here who really were, in addition to David, great partners in that learning process. You mentioned Sandra Reed, and also Una Anderson was a part of those discussions in 2006 and 2007. And I think that's, okay, good. Don't want to miss anybody. So there were two instances where we attempted to negotiate CBAs. One was with the Home Depot. And if you recall, this was at a time after Katrina when folks were scrambling to figure out how we could attract business. And there was a there were two trains running. There were folks saying we really need to be supporting those small, locally based, family-owned businesses, those people whose livelihoods had been decimated. That's where the city needs to focus. And then there were others saying we need big. We need something that's going to catalyze now. And so there were both these trains running, and there was an instance in Central City where there was the opportunity to attract the largest Home Depot in the region. So here we were, shortly after Katrina, all trying to figure out how we could build this community benefits collaborative. And there were really, there was a great collection of partners in our CBC. There's more than one neighborhood association or community organization in Central City. Several of them were represented in our CBC. There were faith-based groups. For one of our agreements, the Merchants and Business Association in the area was a part of the CBC. So the folks that we were able to get to the table were really a part of what worked. Clearly, the support of the Public Law Center was a major aspect of what worked, because we not only had the expertise in how to build the actual agreement, but we had someone, which was really necessary in the Home Depot instance, we had representation so that our CBC could be at the table with the attorneys for the developer. The other part of what worked was, in one instance, we really did have a spirit of cooperation with the developer. So, I can actually share these with you. There was the one that was never gonna work, and then there was one that almost got there. So the agreement with Home Depot was the more fragile of the two, because in their minds, it was not in their interest to enter into any additional agreement. That's one thing. And the second is, David talked about early notification. By the time we really got our mind wrapped around what we were going to ask for, they had already negotiated many of the waivers that they needed with city planning and with city council. So although those kinds of leverage points are on that public-private partnership line of the triangle, they can still be used if you've got the alignment of your council member or your representation in city planning. And I really have to say given the times that we were in, I can completely understand how it was seen as more beneficial to do what it took to get the business there than to, kind of put everything on hold to wait for this CBC to get formulated and really be a part of those negotiations, because there really was a lot at stake at that time. So that was the one instance, and we ended up finding out after several months that there were things happening in the public-private part of this whole deal that we didn't know about. So we weren't getting all of the information in real time. We were getting information sometimes weeks, or in a couple of instances, a few months after some agreements had been made. So that was the one instance. In the case of KFK, they wanted to build hundreds of units of condominiums on several plots of land that had been acquired for a different purpose. And they came to the table really open and willing to negotiate. So some of the things that were included in our agreement that was all but signed, like we would have had one. It was the one that got away. There was a certain percentage of jobs that would be set aside for local residents. The thing that I felt most proud of was that they made an agreement to allocate resources as gap funding for single-family housing development. So they were going to build this large development, and what we knew and who we had at the table were several of our nonprofit developers who were doing single-family housing, and what we wanted to support was filling the gap for folks who wanted to buy homes in the neighborhood so that people who lived in the neighborhood could then be the future homeowners in Central City. So they were willing to support that. So there were a number of really positive pieces that we almost came to an agreement on, but as it turned out, they had concerns about the market for condominium sales. As you may recall, there were lots of condominium projects that were in play at that time, and so that particular project was one that the developer chose not to move forward on, and therefore they never signed the CBA. But there were a couple of lessons that we learned in those processes that I do want to share, because there have been some benefits to us as a community and as a collaborative of organizations in having gone through that experience together. As we were negotiating, we started looking at what are some of the barriers to these leverage points that we're discussing. And in the conversation around support of small and local and minority-owned businesses, we were clear that even if they agreed to that there might be challenges with the bonding issues. And so though we didn't get the agreement signed, there have since been several steps taken. Good Work Network was a part of the CBC, and more recently they've worked with Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation and other partner organizations to find creative ways to support small businesses, minority-owned businesses, in dealing with the challenge of having sufficient bonding to compete for either some of the larger contracts or for parts of some of the larger contracts. And that was one of the barriers that we really uncovered in the CBC conversation, and people who were in those conversations left with, some areas where they could take ground so that the barrier could be alleviated. We also got clear about the need for our having a clear plan, because we spent a lot of time talking to each other and not as much time as we would have liked talking to some of the attorneys for the entities that we were trying to negotiate with. And so we had already done some collaborative community planning, but we have since done additional community planning to document what residents want to see, what's in the plans for community organizations. And so we have a development framework for our neighborhood and an urban design plan for our historic cultural corridor, Aretha-C-Haley Boulevard, and that is on file with the city and with Mr. Gilchrist's office, and it has been used as a tool in the city fine-tuning some of its plans, especially for the streetscape on O.C. Haley. So we definitely came out of that process with an appreciation for having professionally developed, documented plans for where your community wants to go. We also got clear that we weren't getting notice soon enough on things that were happening in our neighborhood. So while we're not yet at the point of actually receiving notices before they get on an agenda, we are definitely receiving the agenda notices and responding to them. And then we also get some additional notices from our city council member about some things that are about to happen or requests that have landed in her office. So those are three areas where we did learn some lessons from that process. And I just want to be encouraging for those communities who may be considering entering a CBA process, that there was the one that we can kind of say, okay, that we really cut our teeth on that one, and there was one that was almost there. So there is hope. It can be done. We haven't made a third attempt to negotiate a CBA, but we've definitely learned positively and grown from the process. So I really want to acknowledge Sandra for the role that she's played in the cross-reach process, and thank you, Eli, for the opportunity to share the lessons that we learned in Central City.
Well, thank you, Kysha, and thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks to all of you for sharing our enthusiasm about CBAs. Each of the people up here have more to share with you, but we'd like to do it in response to your questions in order that we can capture it again for a video, audio record. We'd ask you to use the microphone over here at the side of the room, and certainly we hope what we've said this morning is sufficiently thought-provoking that some of you have further questions about it or comments. So we'll just ask you to line up right there and ask them as they come to you.
My name is Reverend Laura.